Hello, it's Jen Taub. Welcome back to Booked Up, a podcast that features you, me, and our favorite authors. This week, my guest is Ruth Ben-Ghiat. She is a professor of history and Italian studies at NYU. You may know Ruth from her frequent appearances on cable news and her MSNBC opinion column, or her best-selling book, Strongmen, From Mussolini to the Present. Today, I'll be talking with Ruth about our current crop of authoritarian brutes who use corruption, violence, propaganda, and machismo to stay in power, and what we can do to stop them. Let's dive in.
Hello.
Hey there, how are you?
Good. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay.
Great.
Are you in New York right now?
No, I'm in the Hudson Valley.
What are you teaching this coming semester?
2 classes on war. I'm teaching World War II and a class on war and cinema, which is really fun. It goes from World War I to drone warfare. So it's one of my favorite classes to teach.
Yeah, I took quite a few film classes when I was in college. And the Latin American film class was one of the more interesting ones. But what films are you, for your war and cinema class, what films are you showing?
Like some resistance films like Rome Open City and The Battle of Algiers, a big one. Oh. And then a film, American Sniper. And then if we end with a film on drone warfare that has a female commander for the first time, which is Eye in the Sky. Mm-hmm. There's all sorts of good films. So.
What do you accompany the films with in terms of reading? Is it history, or is there also some film theory, or how do you bring that together?
My classes are all interdisciplinary. So this is, in fact, when I do it as an undergrad class, it's cross-listed with cinema studies. Uh-huh. So every week is a different war, but it's also a different problem of the war film. So it's history. So the readings are a little history for the context. Right. Whatever the film problem is, or the film issue is that's represented, or the genre, like we do a week on imperial film, British 1930s, and then something on the film itself, so they can understand, like a critic on the film or something, or an analyst. So it's good.
Wow. Is this a big lecture course?
No, I only do seminars. This is how I'm able to do everything. All my classes are seminars, 2 per semester, and I put them on the same day. And so that day is like, you teach, so that day is like very heavy, and the day before, all the prep, but then it's over, and of course I'm on committees and stuff, but the teaching, that's how I do it.
Yeah, no, I mean, this semester I'm lucky. I'm teaching just Tuesdays and Thursdays, and one is Tuesday, there's 2 classes, and then Thursday, just 1 in the morning. So I'll be able to, it makes a big difference.
Yeah, because you have to have blocks of time, like you've embarked on this. This is a lot of work. You have to have time to focus, or writing. And so that's how, and luckily, I guess, I've been teaching so long, I have some seniority, so they let me do that. And so I don't teach lecture classes anymore because they meet multiple times a week. So
it's funny. I mean, I'm lucky too, but yes, this podcast I think is nice. It's a nice discipline and a bit of some degree an escape, and some degree has synergies. I'm working on a new book, and the manuscript's due, at least the first draft this summer.
Yeah.
But getting outside of the subject matter I'm writing about and looking at how other nonfiction writers approach their topics is interesting to me.
It's good for it's good. It's good for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not good for good for all of us, right? To do that.
Not to tell you should do a lecture, but when I was in college, I took a course on American cinema taught by Annette Insdorf, who was cross-teaching it. You've heard of her?
Oh, yeah.
She taught at Columbia and at Yale. And I don't know the real name of it, but we called it Tuesday Afternoon at the Movies. And so she only taught it on Tuesdays, but she'd show a film, and then we were assigned all these outside films. And back then, you had to go to the film societies and watch them live. Yeah. And sometimes you could rent movies. But I still remember some of the exams because she showed a clip from, I feel like it was Hitchcock's North by Northwest. And, one of the questions was, how is this narrative moved forward without language or whatever. But look,
that's the kind of thing that we do. And I show clips in class, and I'm teaching them about how to understand how film works.
Well, so we could talk about film for a while, I'm sure, but I want to maybe redirect us to your book and really the focus of your research and your personal history. And in reading Strongman, I was looking for glimpses of you, the researcher, the author, and you didn't put yourself in there that much, but I did pull a few things from the introduction. You talk about this memory of being in Rome in the spring of 1994, right around the time that Berlusconi first organizes a government and his initial rise to power. And your apartment was right across the street from a German beer hall. And at night, you describe hearing shouting from the patrons at night. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it was really fateful because I had been studying fascism, and I had done my dissertation on fascism. And I came with a Fulbright for the calendar year of 1994 to continue research. And it so happened that I found an apartment in the center of Rome on this historic street, Via Rasella, where a famous reprisal by the Nazis, partisans had an action there. And the Nazis had this famous reprisal, which was a massacre. And it became known as the Ardientine Cave Massacre because they took all the bodies to these caves and dumped them there. And Via Rasella, you still have the bullet holes in the buildings. And so that was already something to get this apartment there. And I thought, okay, that's an omen. And then the first night I went to sleep, and I'm sure when you're in a new apartment, the very first night, if you get woken up in the middle of the night, you can be disoriented. And what was I woken up with? The sound of Heil Hitler and Viva il Duce. And because I was feeling like, oh my God, I'm on Via Rasella where the Nazis massacred, I was already a little not freaked out, but very conscious of the weight of history. I thought I was dreaming. And so I crawled to the window, and there I saw lit up across the street a German beer hall, which was a gathering point for fascists and Nazis. Now, and why were they doing this in public? Because this campaign where Berlusconi, he was the first person to bring neo-fascists into the government. He made possible a lot of the stuff that we see now with the far right being normalized. Without Berlusconi, we'd never have a neo-fascist prime minister, Meloni, now. So it was a lesson for me in what happens when fascism has kind of been something you talked about at home, and all of a sudden you bring these people, extremists, into a campaign, you ally with them. And so it was like night and day, and people started to openly do their Heil Hitlers, and especially their Viva il Duces. So I lived through this, and that redirected my career of not only studying what happened in the past, but the memory of it in the present.
That is so faithful and also so frightening. You use a word that we use in English sometimes to mean something different. Can you tell me the word partisan? You're using it in a different way.
Yes.
Can you describe what you mean by that?
Yes, this is because partigiano or partisan, it's the resistance fighter. A partisan. Now we use it, in fact, and it's also the other meaning in Romance languages, somebody who's taking a strong side. But that is one of the official words. If you say in Romance languages somebody's a partisan, it means they were in the resistance in World War II.
Did you choose this historic street where the resistance to Mussolini was rounded up and later killed? Did you choose to stay there because of the history, or did it just so happen to be the apartment you found at that time?
I just got lucky.
How?
And it was not, because it wasn't very easy to find an apartment, for, that I could afford on my Fulbright stipend salary. and I wanted to be right in the center. And so I jumped at it. So it was total coincidence, which is why I was so conscious those first days of like when I saw the bullet. I've been to Rome for many years. I knew Rome, but living on there and going out every day looking at those bullet holes, it's like, okay, the past is not past.
And that's a turning point in terms of your kind of melting together the past and alongside study of neo-fascism and sort of where we are today. But I want to rewind a little bit because you're not from Europe. You grew up in California, and you somehow decided to specialize in Italian studies, in history, and specifically in fascism. And, looking at your name on its own, I assumed that you were Jewish, and doing a little preparation for our conversation today, I come to find out that your father was born into a Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jewish family, and your mother is from Edinburgh, Scotland, converted to Judaism. So you were raised Jewish. You appear, and people have seen you before, and I've seen you before. You, like me, I am Jewish, but I have for most of my life sort of passed as, as a white Protestant, and that means you hear things you might not normally hear. I wonder what it's like when you're doing this research. Does not appearing to be whatever it means to look Jewish affect how you've done your research and the things that people tell you maybe when you're undercover?
Yeah, I think anyone who knows the name, which is codes as an Israeli name, although it's actually the Ghiat is it's North African, Middle Eastern. There's towns called Ghiat in Algeria, and it could actually be Muslim as well as Jewish. But I'm actually Jewish, to quote George Santos, because my mother did convert, but it didn't mean anything. And I went to Protestant nursery school, and there was no religion in the family, but we celebrated Christmas and Easter, and there was no Jewish influence, no bat mitzvah, nothing. So it was equally Christian and Jewish, you might say. But when people didn't know my name, that same period where I was so faithful in Rome, I would go to the dry cleaner. And I'd been living in Rome on and off. And so I had this dry cleaner I would go to. And she didn't know my name. She just used to take my first name down for some reason. And she said, "Oh, are you still working on your project?" And I said, "Yeah." She was still working on fascism. And there was always a kind of silence when I would talk about fascism. This time, the same period where Berlusconi's bringing, I think this was after he won the election, so you had neo-fascists in power. She said, "Oh, Mussolini did great things, and he only harmed subversives and Jews." And so that's an example of how she never imagined I was Jewish. Some people thought maybe I must be Italian-American because I spoke very fluent. But anybody who knows my name, I get a lot of anti-Zionist stuff. They just figure, like, they'll say, "I hope you're deported. Go back to it. Go back home." And I'm like, "Where? LA?" But the LA connection is very important because the reason I started studying fascism, because my parents are from Middle East and Scotland, there was no discussion of the Holocaust at home. There was no Holocaust trauma. I learned about it, in school. It was not the politics that mattered from the past was Middle East. Okay. And there was just no emphasis on that whatsoever. Again, we never once went to temple. There was nothing. We didn't have any Jewish friends. But the Pacific Palisades, my town, was a place where many famous exiles had come from Nazism, like the level of Thomas Mann and Arnold Schoenberg. And I got curious about these people. And my high school, Arnold Schoenberg's son was a teacher at my high school. And I started talking to him. So that's how I got interested. It was like imagine that this horrible government comes in and you have to flee halfway around the world and start over. And so that's how I got into fascism, and then I decided to do Italy.
And did you study Italian in high school, or did you study Spanish, or?
No, I studied French, and it's very funny because I tried to take Italian at UCLA, which has a quarter system, so they're only 10 weeks, the classes, and I couldn't learn Italian, and the teacher was like, you better just drop out because you just can't. And then I ended up becoming the chair of the Italian Studies Department for 8 years at NYU. I never teach Italian, but I'm totally fluent.
Okay,
so I'm self-taught.
I'm
self-taught. Yeah.
No, but I love that, because this is that's the message. I think we all have these moments of saying, I want to do this, I believe in this, and I'm just going to tune out the voice of doubt that someone else is trying to put in my brain. But how did you teach it to yourself? Watching Italian movies, or?
I went there
tapes?
And as well, the time tested. I got a boyfriend who didn't know any English, didn't know a word of English. And I ended up living with him for several years. And
did you meet him here, or did you meet him in Italy?
No, in Italy. But when I first arrived in Rome, I had to speak French because I didn't know. So I don't know. I just...
Gosh, that's a great story. So we get a little bit of an interest based on people in your area and a high school teacher. You go to Italy to learn Italian. You find a hot Italian boyfriend. I'm just imposing that. And the rest is history. Okay, but I need to go back to the dry cleaner in the 1990s. So she says this to you in Italian. Mussolini wasn't so bad. He only killed or tortured or whatever. Jews and what?
Subversives.
Subversives.
Leftists, basically, she means.
So did you just stare at her and say nothing, which is sometimes my mode, or did you respond?
I think I stared at her and said nothing because I was horrified. I was equally horrified that she's just tossing out the Jew thing, because Italy participated in the Holocaust. And also the discovery that this woman who I'd known for years, who just, she would say, what people always say, why is your Italian so good? What are you doing? And they'd say, I'm here doing research. And there was just silence when I would mention fascism. And so the floodgate opened because it was now okay. And this background is how I've been able to track what's going on in our country today, where the normalization, it's okay to say things, it's okay to be an extremist. Because I lived through it and I studied it.
And we see this. And so this is where I'm going to now kind of go to the book. And we see this today, true, of course, with Mussolini and Hitler coming to power. They didn't invent anti-Semitism. They didn't invent, scapegoating of minorities and so on. But they normalize and then use that to rise to and hold on to power. So your book is basically structured in three parts, right? We've got getting to power for these strongmen, the playbook, the tools they use to rule, and then finally losing power. And of course, that last part is the most hopeful, because it reminds us that authoritarians fall from power too, or are pushed out. But the first sections are really instructive because it helps us identify today, and for people who've seen you speak or read your work, they know what these hallmarks are. There's some, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but there are some things that were new to me, and it's deciding who's in the bucket, who fits that label of strongmen versus who's off the list. And I noticed that you're really careful about this, to say that in your definition of strongmen, you're referring to those who have attempted to or successfully undermined or overturned democratic system, and you're deliberately excluding those leaders of regimes that never purported to be democratic, like China's Xi, for example. Is that right? I want to make sure I understand why and how you came to that.
So there's a few criteria. One is that I wanted to look at people or situations where democracy was undermined or wrecked. That meant that there was one reason that communists, with the exception of Gaddafi, who was an extreme leftist, he wasn't like a Communist Party person, but he's in there for other reasons. But that's why people who inherit power in an already closed system, like in China, they're not in there. The other criteria was, this is a history, aside from Gaddafi, I'll get back to, this is a history of right-wing authoritarianism. And it's been really interesting, ever since I published the book, people who want to see me as biased, they would say, well, why aren't there any leftists? You're saying that only rightists are authoritarian, not leftists. And I went, and after a bit of this, I went and asked a lot of academic colleagues, or people also write for the media, who do histories of communism. And I say, are people coming to you and asking why you don't have fascists in your history of communism? And they're like, no, we've never been asked that. It's like a thing. You write in the history.
Right.
So, and indeed because everyone knows about fascists, and then they see that, and this was, of course, I'm an American writing when Trump comes on the scene. What are the connections, right? So that's where there's three ages: the age of fascism, and then how does that flow into the age of military coups? And now with the stuff in Brazil, we see. And then what happens after that? The Bolsonaros, the Orbans, and then you have the communists who become fascists. And so I wanted to trace that trajectory because there aren't hardly any books that do that. And that's why that's another reason I don't have North Korea or China or these other communist places.
Well, the book isn't called totalitarianism, right? That's a different frame, and I understand, and that's helpful. One thing I learned then in your discussion, I did not know that the term that we hear a lot, liberal democracies. I didn't realize that it was Fareed Zakaria who, in a piece in Foreign Affairs in 1997, coined or explained that term.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know why I didn't know that.
Well, because it's just, it's gotten kind of swept under because now Orban has claimed it. But I have that in a paragraph where I was talking about we've had problems with our language, not knowing what to call authoritarianism. And this is why the book is not comparative politics. I'm not comparing Hitler to Trump or Trump to Hitler. It's about how did authoritarianism evolve from the age of one-party states, the fascist states, the military dictatorships, to what do we call it today? Now, Orban calls it a liberal democracy, which is his usual BS, self-serving, because he wants to have that democracy in there to pretend. They all pretend that they are, preserving freedom, and that, Erdogan, who's a horrible, despot, has a journalism day, even though he locks up journalists. So they all do this trick. But Fareed Zakaria was noticing back then that there were these new kinds of regimes where new kinds of illiberal states where people get elected. They don't just have a coup, and they don't do a Hitler, quick takeover. They get elected, and then slowly they chip away at democracy.
Right.
That's what we have today.
And I noticed at the beginning of your book, you have a list of, in alphabetical order, the various strongmen, and you give their names and the country and kind of when they were in power, how they got in, how they got out. And what I noticed, and this is what you're also saying, is that somehow those strongmen who came to power before 1990, if we use that as a demarcation, they came in for the first time either through an appointment or a coup. I know it always says Hitler was elected, but his first sort of right stage in power, as you know, was an appointment. And then you get to after 1990, and they're all elected. It's interesting. And so the people just that I mean, there are more, but we've got in chronological order. We're starting in the late 20s, early 30s, right? So we've got Mussolini.
Mussolini declared a dictatorship in 1925, so it goes from the 20s up to today.
So it's all 20th century, from Mussolini in Italy, Hitler, Franco, Gaddafi, Mobutu, Idi Amin, Pinochet, and Hussein. And then after the 90s, we have Berlusconi, Putin, Erdogan, Orban, Modi, Duterte, Trump, and Bolsonaro. What strikes me as I cluster these names together is today we recognize the relationships between, we see Trump trying to buddy up with Putin. We see Berlusconi best friends with Putin. We see Trump trying to, although Gaddafi is a bit of a different thing, but Trump was trying to help, rent some space to Gaddafi. I mean, they all kind of it's like this little authoritarian networking club. And today it's like that, but it was like that before, right?
Yeah, and the one chapter that it didn't fit in the structure of the book was partners.
Yes.
Showing, but I start the book with Berlusconi and Putin. And how, Berlusconi preceded Trump in totally rehabilitating Putin, pushing his agenda, making deals with him. And these people have always, they see each other as kindred spirits. And the thing about it, though, is they're all transactional. You have a deal with an autocrat until you don't. And Stalin found out that because he allied with Hitler, and then Hitler invaded him. Same thing, Hitler, was like Mussolini's big admirer, and then he invaded him. And so they continue to act like this today. And there's all these, is she going to abandon Putin, or are they friends? Or, and I see these things with quite a jaundiced eye. Because they truly will sell each other out as soon as possible. They only care about themselves.
It's fascinating to me now to think about the way we were taught when I was younger, world history, versus how you learn when you look at a microhistory. You focus in on an era. And, in terms of these strongmen partnerships, the discussion around when Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy are trying to help out Franco over in Spain, it's like evil cartoon characters to see this happening. And it's interesting to me because I think the way I knew about those countries, it was all fragmented. I grew up in a family, although we were not I was bat mitzvah, but we weren't very... our practice, that was about it. Like, we didn't like candles or whatever. But I was definitely traumatized by the Holocaust stories when I was a child. So I knew a lot about Hitler. I knew about Franco because I studied Spanish in high school, and my teachers came from España, and he had fought Franco. He's an older guy, and in the war. And then I had a teacher, I knew about Pinochet because the headmaster of my school was from Chile. And so the pieces of things that I put together are based on the adults around me. But I never thought of these men as actually looking to each other, modeling their behavior after each other, and reinforcing their behavior from each other.
One of the advantages, I learned so much, obviously, in doing this book because I hadn't worked on Pinochet. You listed, and I list a lot of people, but I should say that there are case studies, and there are only about 6 of the people or 6 or 7 who are the focus. And then these other people are in there to add, context and extra evidence for things that are going on. But for example, when you do a book that goes over 100 years, these through lines emerge that are very interesting. One of them, for example, the role of extreme Catholicism and Opus Dei.
Yes, I want to ask about that.
Very secretive, corrupt, extreme Catholic sect. And they were put in charge, and Francisco Franco, and this Spanish Catholic Church is an enormous pillar of that regime. And he put them in charge of liberalizing the economy. So they're economists, they're policymakers who are members of Opus Dei. Then those, the same Opus Dei, not the same people, Pinochet does the same thing. Opus Dei was very instrumental to implementing neoliberalism. So we hear about Milton Friedman, justifiably, and the Chicago Boys, but some of those Chicago Boys were also members of Opus Dei. And then I thought, okay, we know those cases. So then here I go along into the 21st century. Berlusconi, the same guy. These people have these inner circles. And so this is a good example of how they work. Marcello Dell'Utri is this now convicted criminal. He was Berlusconi's right-hand man. Berlusconi let him take control of a huge advertising conglomerate when he became prime minister. He was Berlusconi's liaison to the mafia. He was convicted of mafia association and Opus Dei. The same person, mafia and Opus Dei, is very economical, very efficient. And then the biggest shock, Trump. In Trump's inner circle, there were numerous people who were linked to Opus Dei, William Barr, Pat Cipollone, Larry Kudlow, like many of them, Roger Severino. So here we have a through line that goes back to Franco, and we have to keep, we hear a lot about evangelicals and non-denominational Christians, and, they're being radicalized, but keep an eye open about the radical Catholics, because Ron DeSantis is one of them. Now, I don't think he's connected to Opus Dei, I don't have any evidence, but the Catholic stuff, I was shocked to see that went all the way up to the Trump administration. So that's the kind of thing you can learn when you do a book like this.
And the fact that, and you mentioned Opus Dei, but it's particularly, it's not just an extreme organization, a part of Catholicism, but a very extreme elite group. It's male. And that brings me to, what is this is a book called Strongman or Strongmen. It's not called Strong People. This is specifically coded and gendered as male, which is part of the process. Can you walk through what that, I think there's 5 pieces, but what are the main, what are these tools of rule that you talk about?
So Strongman is the first book to put machismo, or I call it virility. There was discussion with my editor, what do we call this? Masculinity, as a tool of rule, saying it's as important as the others for this particular configuration of power. So you have propaganda, corruption, machismo, violence, and I had the myth of national greatness, the idea that only he can save the nation. And all of these intersect. And the strongman, if you want, the definition, is somebody who's an authoritarian who damages or destroys democracy, but also uses masculinity as a way of legitimizing himself. They use their bodies, they use they perform, they use their virility to in the ways that, for example, the corruption tie is they are the man who gets away with it all, who can't be held accountable. And so when Trump comes along at the end of January 2016 and says, I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and I wouldn't lose any followers, I was like, he's saying he's violent. So there's the machismo and the violence. And he's going to get away with it. He'll be rewarded for it. And so that's the corruption. So the machismo, in a way, is the glue of the whole thing. And yet political scientists have done a ton of work on gender and politics, et cetera. But people who study authoritarianism didn't take masculinity seriously.
Yeah.
And I think being a woman, I was, maybe better equipped to really delve into this, not just as like pictures of Putin with no shirt on, but get down and see how does this actually affect governance.
And what's interesting is for some people who are not necessarily the top dog or the top ape in this hierarchy, they are kind of trying to pose or perform. I think of a Josh Hawley, who's always trying to act as if he has that kind of virility. He simply doesn't. He's not projecting it. He doesn't have it. But then you look at somebody like, I think it's Berlusconi. I'm forgetting who were it might have also been
Duterte.
Was it Mussolini, who actually had this whole system of procurement where they were trying to find
Gaddafi
women.
and Mussolini. So It's Mussolini, Gaddafi, and Berlusconi.
And it's a certain kind of sexuality. It's not mutual. It's pretty close to rape and torture. It's not that this is not respect and love for women. This is just using their bodies and then tossing them aside or controlling them. Yeah.
Yeah. A way to think about it, which is very scary, is think of Jeffrey Epstein as the head of state.
Yeah.
Jeffrey Epstein, who could use the resources of the state to scout women, to procure women, to pay off women. So my first example...
And children in some cases.
And children,
yes.
And pay for abortion, all the fixers. So
yes.
What they would do is they use their secret police and their scouts to find women who are Gaddafi had the best developed system where scouts would find beautiful women at rallies, start to follow them, kidnap them. And he had sex dungeons. He had one specially built under the University of Tripoli. So he would go to university to give a talk, and he would see somebody, and he would take them. And then they became sexual slaves. And there's hardly anything on this for Libya because also women are ashamed. And it's dangerous to talk about it. But Gaddafi was famous for having the female bodyguards that everybody saw. Well, guess what? Those bodyguards had a night job, and they were the same sexual slaves. So that's the it's not just sensationalism. It's that if you have that kind of power, you use the apparatus of the state for your personal satisfaction.
And all of these people participated in it. And in some cases, it was the wives of people near him because it was his way of humiliating them and consolidating power, making it impossible for them to take his spot, whichever of these men that I'm referring to.
Yes.
It's
And then
it's really disturbing.
When you get to Berlusconi, it's relevant for Trump too, because these men, they have their businesses, Trump real estate, Berlusconi on TV networks, but they also go into businesses that allow them access and control of networks of women. I call it inflows of bodies, pipelines of bodies. So Berlusconi and Trump were into beauty, beauty pageants.
Yes.
Trump, had a model agency. Berlusconi, he owned all of the commercial TV networks. Can you imagine? He was prime minister. He owned. So all the women who wanted to become stars would get into this pipeline, and then he had these sex parties. And you were rewarded. It was a whole system, again, of procurement, of paying off, of maintenance. And it all revolved around them as the head of state. Trump did not dissolve Trump models until well into 2017. So it's the same dynamic.
And Berlusconi, even with the trial going on related to the sex parties and the underage person there and so on, even with that, he was still popular. It was only because someone senior to him, right? This is... the president said, you need to step down as prime minister. Is that right?
Yeah, all the corruption. And it was as great as Trump, corrupt in myriad ways. Again, his right-hand man was convicted of mafia association and kept being a senator, by the way, for years. So there's mafia, there's all kinds of corruption. None of it touched him. He was like Teflon, just like Trump. People say, well, why? Like for years, he's been doing these crimes and corruption. The only reason he left office was the Eurozone crisis, where Angela Merkel and other heads of state got together and said he has to leave. So he was asked to resign. And then after that, he was prosecuted. But he remained popular, and his even when the news of the underage sex parties came out, that's the personality cult. That's why you never underestimate Trump.
Right.
So that's why those people are in there, and it's also why there is no Italian edition of my book. And 25 or I think it's up to 30 publishers have rejected my book. And someone finally told me the problem isn't Mussolini. The problem's Berlusconi.
Is the book in libraries in Italy in English, though, or no?
I don't know. But I thought
you should check out it on WorldCat and see whether anyone can even read it in Italy.
I'm sure the English edition is there, but it doesn't seem like there's going to be. And when you start with Berlusconi and Putin, it's too.
Yes, and Berlusconi in a bed that Putin may have given him. We're not entirely sure. Let me talk about the corruption, though, because as we're talking about, there are these myriad people who are helping these strongmen do various illegal and unethical things. Corruption works not just with the authoritarian skimming money out of the country, and you provide a lot of numbers that are really helpful for what's happening here, whether it was Mobutu or Putin. But the corruption is it's so much deeper than that, and I'm going to read this passage from page 166 because this, for whatever reason, this felt like I was being stabbed in the heart. This seemed more insurmountable than anything in terms of fighting corruption anywhere in the world. So here's what you wrote.
Yeah.
Corruption assists in recruiting enablers and accomplices of state persecution, whether police and military who operate on the streets or elites who confer in boardrooms and private clubs. In the middle are bureaucrats, scientists, and propagandists who take care of the ideology, logistics, and finances of persecution. Authoritarian states have always promoted individuals who are willing to experiment with repression as a way of reshaping the nation. You're covering all of society getting a benefit in keeping something really horrific going.
Yeah, I remember when I wrote that, I thought, oh, okay, that you write, of course, too, and you're a specialist on corruption. That somehow, sometimes things flow and they express a lot in an economical way. And I really wanted to focus on these three tiers that there are. In fact, I've been giving a lot of interviews right now on Brazil, what's happened with Brazil. And I'm always saying that for every one thug who's smashing the windows and smashing the Capitol Police head, there are two people in suits and ties or a military uniform or other uniform who are making it possible.
Sorry, by the way, what's happening in Brazil, you mean the attempted coup?
Yes.
So that supporters of Bolsonaro not wanting Lula to take office. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, and trashing the three pillars of democracy: Supreme Court, the Congress, and the presidential palace. And so you have the people who are visible, the black shirts, the people at the rallies, saluting swastikas, and then, though, equally important are the people, as I say, in the boardrooms and private clubs who are also the people that after a regime falls or even just a Trump presidency, they just go back to their law firms. Look at Steve Mnuchin. You go back much enriched by your and you pay no price. And those people are the enablers, the elite.
Right.
Elite enablers. But then there's in the middle, and these are academics. My first book on fascism talked a lot about how academics and scientists were very crucial to spreading, fascist ideology and financing it, the bankers. So all these people, it's really devastating, actually. I know why, and you know so much about corruption, so of course you felt like, this
and
stab in the heart.
I think it's a stab in the heart, too, because some people are doing it and not even realizing they have so much more free will than they know they have. It's sort of like self-selection into systems where you just kind of do what everyone else is doing or research what everyone else is doing or take on a client everyone else is taking on without even thinking, you don't need to do that anymore, or you never did.
Yeah.
Speaking of enablers, though, and this is it's so hard to see these things. There's some names, like you said, Opus Dei, that pops up. Henry Kissinger. Can we just talk about him for a moment? Who hasn't? Henry Kissinger is like an advisor to these authoritarians in the same way. It almost, not quite, that Paul Manafort pops up in here. Am I seeing this wrong here?
Oh, he's done way more damage than Paul Manafort. Just the cases I know the most about, because he was so instrumental to the coup in Chile. And one thing I hadn't known.
Overthrowing Allende so that Pinochet could come in.
Yeah. Yes. So the military staged a coup to overthrow Allende, who was a non-aligned leftist, a socialist, but not a communist. And it was a U.S.-backed coup. And Kissinger, who was a refugee from Nazi Germany, he convinced Nixon that Allende was going to become like Adolf Hitler. He used the Hitler analogy to convince Nixon and other people to do this coup. Mm-hmm. And so Kissinger he's part of Cold War. So he's a refugee for Nazi Germany, which made it again, stab in the heart. Dude, you left Nazi Germany and now you're causing a right-wing coup, which, by the way, lots of Nazis were in Chile. There was a whole German community. So anyway, and then we see him, this is why, again, stab in the heart, who pops up at the White House the infamous day that Lavrov and Kislev go into the Oval Office with only a tasked Russian photographer present with Donald Trump. This is such treason. Who has a meeting with Trump right before that, the same day? Henry Kissinger. And he's an advisor to Putin. So his fingerprint is everywhere.
Yep. Oh, so much about that to be said. I want to turn our direction to the hopeful side of your writing and maybe the hopeful part of our lives, which is the idea that we can resist, that these tyrants always fall, but that we have to do a little pushing. And there are different things that you write about. But before I actually turn to your discussions on what we can do, I noticed something when I was preparing, is that it looks like one of your earliest scholarly pieces that you wrote was back in 1997. Maybe it was a book chapter about a film I adore by Robert Benigni, the film Life is Beautiful. And can you remind me a little bit about why about that film, why you chose to write about it? And I think the title of the piece was The Secret Histories of Roberto Benigni's Life is Beautiful.
So, yeah, it's so interesting. I loved the film too. And I think it was the Yale Journal of Criticism asked me to write an article on it. So I started researching it. And I found that Roberto Benigni, his father, was a prisoner of the Nazis, but they're not Jewish. He was an Italian prisoner of war. And and Hitler and Mussolini were allied. And so they were fighting in the Axis together. And so Benigni's father was one of these Axis soldiers. But then Italy surrendered in September 1943. Overnight, Italians became the enemies of the Nazis who were determined to avenge this. And so they flooded into Italy and they arrested 800,000 Italians, whether they were in Italy or a lot of them were abroad fighting for the Axis. And they were taken by surprise. And Roberto Benigni's father ended up in a German camp. These are not extermination camps, these are prison camps, as a German prisoner. And he was very scarred by this, and then he came back. But that's what gave Benigni the idea. But he didn't want to write about the German prisoners, the prisoners of war, because oh my God, they were actually fighting for Hitler and Mussolini, and then they became the victims. So he turned his father into a Jew in that sense. He decided to focus on the Jews who were deported, who never were for the Axis. And so that's the secret history.
And the film, though, why did it mean so much to you besides the backstory and what motivated him?
Because just the fact it was being made and talked about, and that this is a side of history that the Italians don't want to remember. And again, 1997 was 3 years. He made this for a reason also, that the story I told you is Berlusconi came in 1994, and even though he had to leave, the government fell after 6 months. Those neo-fascists never left. They were, from then on, neo-fascism was rehabilitated.
Because he created that party, Italia, what was it called? A Forza Italia or something?
It was National Alliance, and they had been in government, and they were rehabilitated. And so he makes this film in a way to remind people of what fascism did. So that was very important. Yeah.
I like that you're giving me the historical context for this. And it's funny because when I saw it, and the reason why I'm mentioning it now, when I first saw it, what struck me is the lengths that the father goes to in this film to try to make his child not panicked in the face. Like he wasn't, he's facing, they're hiding out from the Nazis. They're trying not to get caught in this ghetto. And instead of terrifying the son, he's like, oh, those people are just all actors. And he put a happy spin on it. He wasn't putting his head in the sand and letting them take them away. He was trying to keep his son safe, but he was also not just keeping him physically safe, but keeping him emotionally safe. And I thought of this film right after Trump was elected in November 2016, because I knew the kind of person he was, in part because of my research on white-collar crime, in part because my then high school age daughter was taking a course on genocide. And, you just knew exactly what kind of person Trump was. I'm sure you knew immediately. And I knew it was going to get really ugly. And I felt that I had to try to keep my people around me, keep their spirits high, which brings me to what ultimately, a question for you, and it has to do with those final chapters. Are you genuinely hopeful that we're going to get through this period we're in with the rise of fascism and authoritarianism right here in America and across the globe? Are those chapters that you wrote just sort of throwaway because you feel like you have to say something about stopping it? Is this inevitable? Is Trump going to win another term? Is Trumpism going to continue to blossom and so on?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting period we're in because, in a way, authoritarianism elsewhere is showing its weakness. Mm-hmm. It's a big deal that there are those protests in China. 79 universities had protests in China, including Xi's alma mater, which is like an elite incubator. And Russia, the whole Ukraine war, has enlightened the world as to this paper tiger of the Russian army, into Putin's incompetence.
Right.
And so there are a lot of lessons. I call it autocratic backfire, where it's just revealed how the Russian military is ravaged by corruption, by kleptocracy. So there's a lot of things going on. And look at Iran. So we're also, and we don't hear about this enough, which is why it's in my resistance chapter, we're in the middle of a global renaissance of protest. I mean, the fact that there are protests in Iran, and you see the savage, draconian measures they use, and it still continues. So all of this is a sign, especially younger people there who also voted overwhelmingly in the midterms in our country. They're simply not going to stand for this. And they have the most to lose because authoritarianism is a constellation of things that includes, environmental destruction. Mm-hmm. It's like, for them, it's like an existential need and imperative to protest. Like Brandon Wolf, who an LGBTQ activist was talking after the latest. He said, we only want to live. Is that too much to ask?
He survived the Pulse nightclub shooting, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's going on. However, in part because of that, you're going to see that these plundering, exploitative regimes led by, with the exception of Italy, led by men who are not getting any younger, are going to be roaring back because they're threatened. And in fact, what we see in China, there's lots of things going wrong in China, and that's why Xi's been puffing his personality cult up, and now we could have something going on with Taiwan. to in part compensate, long planned, but also accelerated because of protests. So it's very so because it's showing its weakness abroad, it's all the more tragic that the GOP is just barreling down that path. But I'm an optimist. I'm a believer in humanity. I'm an optimist by nature, which is how I could get through writing a book like this. So those chapters are not there just for narrative, pleasure or whatever, or balance. They're there because there's a whole history that's connected of resistance tactics that work. Nonviolent mass protests can work in the right circumstances.
I love that because I felt that way, but I was just checking to see if I'm and you talk about this person who was elected, and I want to say in Chile on a Radical Love platform. Is that the right country?
In Turkey.
Oh, in Turkey. I'm sorry. And the human chain of 2 million people. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So the human chain is it was a technique that was used during the fall of communism, where protesters crossing 3 Baltic nations linked hands in this enormous chain that, again, it went over the borders of 3 nations. And what's so moving about it is that it was revived in 2019 in Hong Kong, where they also did linking hands. And there was, in anti-Berlusconi protests in the early 2000s, there was this movement called the merry-go-round, where they linked arms and they encircled the Minister of Justice, the Ministry of Communications, all the threatened government buildings. So I have that there because there are these techniques that travel. So there's the autocratic playbook that they borrow from each other, but resistors borrow too. Mm-hmm. And it's important to know that and to publicize that.
It seems to me that one thing I'm seeing in common is this idea of the crowd and whether, are we as members of the crowd supporting each other, or are we getting our power from this strongman who is giving us power because he's giving us permission to push down on 50% of the population, like women, or push down, and I think that's the question people have to ask. What bargain do you want? And I am glad to see young people wanting to link arms instead of raising their arm and salute
exactly
to someone.
And just a little aside, what the Hitler salute was a very genius thing because it forced people. You had to do it anytime you went in a store, anytime you entered a classroom. You had to do it. So you were constantly showing to others your conformity, but it also kept people at a distance. Because you couldn't hug somebody it was designed to, and that's why also eventually the Italian fascists banned the handshake and banned kissing, and you had to have the Roman salute because you have to keep people at a distance. So you don't have the linking of arms, you don't have the human touch and the solidarity. And so the Hitler salute, it embedded imprinted, you could say, these distancing habits. And imagine every time you and I met on the street and we're talking about a third person, Heil Hitler, he's there with us. So it ruins intimacy. And that's what authoritarians, including in the States, are trying to do. They turn people on each other. That's why in Texas, in other states, they're not only offering bounties to people who, to capturing or telling on people who are performing abortions, but people who are assisting them. So they're trying to ruin these networks of solidarity.
And I think that tells us exactly, and your book does, how to resist and to avoid the attraction of these kinds of fascist leaders is to come together, not let someone exploit our divisions, find our common ground.
Exactly.
So as we wrap things up, can you tell me how people can find you? Besides in your highly subscribed, very small seminars that sound fascinating at NYU that are, I'm sure, already full with a waiting list. Other than that?
I have, like many people these days, I have a Substack newsletter called Lucid, Lucid, and I chose that because it's the clarity of thought when we're not under the impression of, under the influence of disinformation, et cetera. So you can find my writings weekly there. And I also hold Q&As every single week.
And by the way, I am not just a subscriber. I've also been a guest, thank you, for one of the Q&A sessions, live Q&A sessions. So thank you so much on that.
Yeah, and I'd like to have you back. There's been a request for you to come back, actually. So there's that. Or I have a website, www.ruthbenghiat.com. Not always updated as I should. And then my Twitter, I'm still on Twitter, and that's where a lot of my, reactions to things at Ruth Ben-Ghiat.
Well, thank you so much, Professor, or I guess I've been calling you Ruth this whole time.
Ruth is good.
I'm glad that you have this expertise, and then also saddened that it's become so important. But come to think of it, I think given human nature, we always need to be vigilant and try to support our better sides so that we don't fall prey to this kind of manipulation. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Wow. I could have continued that conversation with Ruth a lot longer. And I'm not kidding when I tell you I would love to take that film seminar she's teaching. Somehow she should turn it into, I don't know, a TED Talk or some kind of lecture that we can all watch. I know I definitely would sign up for that. There are a few things I wanted to mention about her book that I didn't get a chance to, which is, despite the complicated and sometimes depressing topic, it is written so well and so clearly. And she makes really interesting choices with vocabulary, with language, and with narrative. And there's one example that I particularly appreciated. Toward the beginning of the book, she's describing a scene where Berlusconi is with a woman in their bedroom, and apparently they're being recorded. And the way Ruth describes this person describes her as Berlusconi's partner for the evening, which I thought was an interesting and respectful way to get to what was going on without demeaning this person who was, in that particular role. There are other aspects of the book that if I'd had more time, I would have asked her about. I would have gotten into some of the more specific details around money. There are things about Mobutu of Zaire, where the way the numbers add up is that if money had not been siphoned off in the way it was, the country would have been, and the people in the country, so much wealthier. But sometimes it's hard to talk about different numbers, for voice, as opposed to being able to see those on paper. So thank you for joining us. And I will, of course, be back next week with another show as we continue to explore the writing process and the nonfiction world together. Let us know what you think. Send me an email to bookedup@politicon.com, or you can also write us at Bookedup, P.O. Box 147, Northampton, Massachusetts, 01061. To keep up with the show and our featured authors, follow Booked Up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And please give Booked Up a 5-star review. It really does help other people find us.